Hello and welcome to Nightmare Tonight. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. In this episode, I have with me filmmakers Derek Murphy and Mitchell Zamil, and they will be talking about their project called Preserving Worlds on Means TV. Why don't you two talk about your respective roles on Preserving Worlds?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Derek Murphy. I'm the writer and director on the series.
And my name's Mitchell Zamil. I'm the editor, cinematographer, whatever other stuff.
And so what is Preserving Worlds?
Preserving Worlds is a documentary series, a series of short documentaries. Each one is between 12 minutes and a half hour. And it's for the streaming service Means TV, which is a worker-owned leftist streaming service. The series is about, well, let's see, Mitchell, maybe you can sum it up a little better than me.
Sure, yeah. To sum it up, Preserving Worlds, I would say, is about dying or defunct virtual worlds, whether that's an online chat environment or just a community that's sort of grown around a particular game. And it's about the people who are keeping these spaces, these virtual spaces going, keeping them alive and functioning, and sort of the passion behind that effort.
Yeah, because these are all games that are no longer particularly generating a lot of profit, I would say. Perhaps,
right.
Doom might still be generating some profit, but we covered the Doom mapping community, which is definitely not generating income. So yeah, these are games that are not really active in the marketplace so much anymore, but they still are beloved by a really hardcore community of players. And so we spoke in each episode. We focused on a different game, and we spoke with a particularly passionate and active member of the community of that game, and with kind of a special focus on sort of like archival preservation efforts in a way, but usually outside of institutions, usually more hobbyist preservation, what actions players are taking to keep the game alive, but also document what it's like to play the game and help onboard new people if they're interested, that sort of thing.
I got a chance to watch the first two episodes, which cover Worlds Chat and ZZT, respectively. Really fascinating stuff. I noticed, was it the first one was recorded quite some time ago? So how long have you two been working on this?
That's right. So the first episode, which was sort of like a pilot, sort of a short film on its own, before we expanded it into a series, that was shot and mostly edited in 2015 or so. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the episodes were done last year, starting back in May.
That first episode was actually, that World's Chat one was going to be a scene in a feature film that Mitchell and I made together called Sarasota Half in Dream, which is sort of a surrealist / situationist nature documentary about the town of Sarasota, Florida, which is our hometown. As it already would seem clear, that scene had nothing to do with the rest of the film, aside from some thematics in common. So we ended up cutting it because the subject matter was just too different from the main subject of the film. But the material was strong enough that we wanted it to be its own thing outside of just a deleted scene. So we lengthened it and cut it into a standalone short, which was popular enough on Means TV and interesting enough subject matter to us that we decided to pursue it as a series.
It's funny how stuff like that works out.
Yeah.
So, many of these old games are becoming obsolete from like a technological perspective. And so there seems to be like a common fear that these sort of precious things are going to be lost to time. What do you think drives this sort of need to archive this kind of material?
Yeah, well, for one thing, that concern you mentioned is very real, and it has happened before. It's, you know, popularly known that the early history of cinema is marked by a dramatic loss of works. So, an enormous percentage of silent cinema is lost today. You can read about its existence in like pamphlets from the time, but you cannot watch the films. And it's just a complete unknown what they were even like sometimes. Sometimes all you have is just titles. So that happened for a number of reasons. Film companies not really caring to preserve the stuff. They were kind of churning through it. They didn't really have a lot of storage for these film prints, and the film prints were volatile, et cetera, et cetera. Wasn't a lot of academic interest either in archiving them yet because it was a new medium that wasn't really considered artistically valuable. Video games are kind of, you could argue, in that space right now. And certainly a lot of developers are not really, there are plenty of developers that are taking great efforts to preserve like the source code of their games, but there are also plenty of large corporations that don't really want to dedicate the budget required to do that. And on top of that, like video games are even more unstable and difficult to preserve for the long term than film ever was. I mean, a film print, if left alone in a closet, can survive for many decades, like relatively intact. Whereas a video game, like, there's a complex series of digital files that need to survive on a storage medium that is much more volatile than a film print most of the time, unless you put it on tape, which is something very few people do. And even then, if you actually do have those files preserved, then in a few decades, you really might not be able to run them on any modern computers. So you really need to take active steps to keep them preserved. So video games can easily be lost. You could easily envision a world 50 years from now where only the most popular video games are still actually playable, and there may be hundreds or thousands of games from back in the day that you can only read about. And, people care a lot about these games, and especially some of these games that we profiled, these online games, are community spaces. They are places where people can connect over a distance. And sometimes people, have a hard time meeting people in person. I mean, right now, that's especially clear. And then it's also a place that people can express their identities free of any consequence. And that can be important if you live, say, in a super conservative area where it's not really viable, or it can be a little dangerous to be out in certain ways. So they matter, and they're going to be interesting, I think, to historians. And these online games especially, it's difficult to preserve what matters about them in some ways, because even if you do take all those steps and preserve the software, in 50 years, I mean, sure, you can maybe, enter into the World of Warcraft, but you're going to be the only one there. And you're not going to miss, you're not going to be able to experience what it was actually like, what it was meaningfully like to play the game back in the day. So with this series, we're hoping that we can kind of document that subjective side of it, that experience of it, and, try to be entertaining about it too. But maybe in a few decades, maybe someone's going to find some value in what we've done here.
Yeah, that's really interesting to project into the future and think about maybe the sort of anthropological value of this type of archival work. There's a quote from Gradual Dime that sticks out in the first episode. Gradual Dime says, "We run the risk of forgetting where we came from and how simple the ones and zeros used to be." I just love that.
Yeah, he was so eloquent, and we only found him via a research paper he had written about Worlds Chat. He'd written a paper that was his attempt to document the culture and the contents of Worlds Chat, and I thought it was pretty well done. I mean, he is not someone with professional archival experience or anything like that, but he did a pretty great job, and he definitely got across why Worlds Chat mattered to him and to others. So I saw that paper and I thought, this is fascinating stuff this guy's doing, and I'd love to talk to him about his experience in Worlds Chat. And it was wonderful to find that he was an extremely friendly and eloquent and interesting guy. So excellent subject for an episode.
For sure. Derek, I think it was you that touched on something I wanted to ask about, which is, I guess, a sort of common thread I was able to identify with these online communities is that they seem to fill a hole in people's lives where you might say in previous generations there might be local communities that would be more capable of serving that role, but for a number of reasons, maybe the atomizing nature of capitalism is part of that. These communities either don't exist or aren't accessible to certain people. So it's, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I've been talking a lot, so I'll try and be quick so Mitchell can speak on it as well. But we did really, part of our intentionality selecting these episodes, selecting which games to profile was they all have a really low barrier to entry. They're all basically free or less than $5, like one $5 payment to get into. Like Doom, you have to like buy Doom unless you pirate it, but it's like less than $5 to buy Doom, right? So, but a lot of these are just straight up free to play completely. That low barrier to entry financially means that like anyone can log into these. And, you know, that's not always the case in the physical world. I mean, if you want to go to a bar, you got to pay for expensive drinks or go to a club, right? Or, you know, if you even can. I mean, obviously during the pandemic, you can't, but even before the pandemic, like you said, our society is increasingly atomized. There are very fewer and fewer like third places, I guess people like to call them, social places that aren't work or home. Yeah, Mitchell, what do you think?
Yeah, totally. To add specifically, you know, to the thought of the erosion of these kinds of communal spaces in the physical world, I know partly, you know, that is actually, you know, something that's been observed and recorded, you know, the death of like bowling clubs, et cetera. I think it's also interesting to point out that, you know, depending on who you are or, you know, your specific, I guess, demographic, these online spaces may or may not, you know, interest you more or less. So, you know, for example, a lot of these spaces and games were popularized and, you know, the communities were sort of built up by teenagers, right? People who have a lot of time and energy to put into, you know, these very particular gaming interests, but may not have the money to go out and do other things in the real world. And I know, you know, we talked about growing up in Sarasota, Florida, which is historically a very old town population wise. You know, like the average age when we were growing up there was like 65 or something.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to jump in and add that it's the last time I checked, Sarasota County had the highest median age of any county in the entire United States.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's when we say very old person town. Yeah, a lot of people come down to retire. And I know from my personal experience, the cul-de-sac and at large, the neighborhood I grew up in, for the longest time, my sister and I were the only children in that area. So we didn't have people that we could like, you know, run up to their house and, you know, ask them to come outside and play ball with. You know, I definitely from a very early age turned to online spaces as a way of sort of making connections. Obviously, you know, I knew some people in the real world, but like, you know, it have to be something where like my mom could like drive me to their house or drop me off, or they could pick me up or something. And so having access to an online community that I could be a part of was much more immediate and attainable for me at that time.
I would say that I also don't necessarily think that online spaces picking up the slack for the lack of social spaces in real life. I don't really necessarily think that's a good thing. Obviously, I think it would be much nicer if our society actually provided safe, free, and welcoming spaces for community engagement. But in their absence, you know, it is at least, I guess, we can have these things picking up some of that slack.
That's hopefully something we can work towards in 2022.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. But I do see your point. Maybe these online communities sort of operate as something of have a kind of palliative effect. It's really not, doesn't really fulfill those roles adequately, but it stands in. And there's also this element of, I don't know, would it be fair to say like power struggles within these communities that I think is interesting. I'm just thinking back to in your second episode on the game ZZT, Dr. Doss says that the whole community went through a kind of dark phase in the 2000s when I guess edgelords sort of maintained kind of hierarchy in that community. But now it seems to have matured. I mean, that's pretty much par for the course with the early 2000s.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But
Yeah.
I was really into like making Flash cartoons and uploading them to Newgrounds. So
that's
that
me.
was like, yeah, that was like the haven of edgelordism. But yeah, so I haven't gotten a chance to watch your episode on Second Life, but I think this is it's kind of changed my perspective to some degree, because I used to watch these YouTube videos where people would go around sort of trolling people in Second Life, and it was very much like a derogatory thing in hindsight of making fun of people. It was really kind of toxic. So yeah, I just wanted to say that it kind of changed my perspective.
I appreciate that. Yeah. I think that times have changed online. I mean, more people are online than in the early 2000s. Back in the day, it was a rather more limited demographic of the sorts of people who were spending time online. And I think it probably was a little bit more young men than today.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just like dominant online. A lot of these online communities, especially in the realm of video games, I guess that's the key thing, is in the realm of like online games, that was mostly young men. And like probably as an effect of like the way that they were marketed, video games have this problem where the entire history of the medium, well, not the entire history, but much of the history of the medium, they were seen as like a product that was marketed to a specific demographic, young men. And when you only have young men involved in a community, things can get a little rough, a little edgy, right? So
yeah,
a lot of these communities that we've looked at now are quite old by this point, and the people who started as angry young men have become rather more mellow middle-aged men. And so you see a very different dynamic in them.
Yeah. One thing I really appreciated, speaking of, Dr. Doss and the ZZT episode, is how they talked about, when they're going back through the history of the community and sort of documenting these things, they didn't try to ignore any of that stuff that was going on, while also not trying to like bring retribution, raining down on anybody in particular, because they understand that, people do change, and, teenagers do grow up to become, more mature adults who are themselves very embarrassed at what they used to do online. And so, I think that was a really nice approach, where you can't just ignore that it happened, but you also have to acknowledge that, times have changed and people change and people grow. And that felt very positive to me.
Yeah, and not highlighting, like, he didn't, name names, which I think is clearly the best approach. Like, it's been a long time and people have grown up, and they don't need to be reminded of the time they acted like a dick when they were 13 years old online.
Right. It's really, I guess I appreciate it as a kind of oral history almost. And I'm just thinking of the time that AOL called my mom to tell her what I had been saying on AIM, on like the chat logs. I don't even remember the type of horrific shit I was saying.
Were you bullying Smarter Child?
Smarter Child was like the I guess like the AI, right?
Right.
It would talk to you.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
AI bot that everyone used to mess with. Yeah, man, I forgot about
Oh my
that.
god. But it is really it's really fascinating getting this oral history. ZZT in particular,
Mhm.
it's just like this whole world I never knew existed,
Yeah.
and the lengths that people go to preserve these things is really inspiring.
Yeah, I'll admit I had not heard of ZZT either before we started production on the new episodes. But Derek, I know that you were, a ZZTer back in the day, played some games and such, right?
Yeah, so to speak. I was a little bit of I was just a lurker. I was just playing the games. I never made one, and I wasn't really particularly active in the community. But I did appreciate some of the stuff they were putting out back in the day, and I really got a kick out of including a few of my old favorite games from back in the day in the footage we used in this episode. Like Burger Joint, for example, was always my favorite. And it was cool to hear from Dr. Doss that the guy who made that Burger Joint game in the early 2000s, who was a teenager himself and went to summer camp right after he released it, he is now an adult and is developing indie games and releasing them on Steam. And I think moderately successful. So it's kind of fun to see where the roots of that like hobbyist game development community have like grown into people professionally putting out games today. Kind of amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very cool. One thing in particular I thought was noteworthy was that the source code for ZZT got lost over time, and someone had to actually like reverse engineer it in order to create an emulator. Am I getting that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That blew my mind when I saw that. I mean, reverse engineering source code is not easy. It takes a ton of time and painstaking effort and trial and error because and I'm not like a developer or a software engineer by any means, so I'm going to have to be a little vague as I describe this myself. But the impression I've got is the source code is like the human readable code that the programmer wrote the software in, and then that source code gets compiled into the binary executable. And when you've got the executable, that's not human readable. That's just the ones and zeros. And when you have that, you can't unambiguously go back from that into the human readable source code because the way that the programmer coded it, basically there are multiple different inputs that could have led to the binary in various ways. And so you can't reverse it. So what the person who did that had to do was do a lot of guesswork and like look at the evidence in the executable and have a really intimate understanding of the behavior of the software and make guesses about what code could have led to that outcome. And I know there are automated tools that like help you with this that kind of automatically go through the executable and give you like a set of options of like some possibilities of what the code could have been. But then you have to really be thorough to figure out what the actual answer is. And software is complicated, and there may be hundreds of these little decisions you have to make that eventually you need the source code that you've reverse engineered to perfectly replicate the executable when you run it, which, yeah, it's mind boggling to me. Like that takes a ton of skill and time and effort and knowledge. So this person under the name Azi Kirka just put this out on GitHub. And then also Azi Kirka is incredible. They created a emulator for ZZT as well called Zeta so before that, people were emulating ZZT using DOSBox, which is like a DOS emulator because ZZT doesn't run on modern operating systems. It was a DOS game. So people were emulating the entire operating system of DOS and then running ZZT within it. And what Azi Kirka did was create an emulator that only emulates the parts of DOS that are necessary in order to run ZZT, which makes it far more lightweight and less likely to like break on weird little edge cases. And so that allowed Dr. DOS to put that Zeta emulator embedded within the Museum of ZZT website that he runs, which is like the online repository where you can find, download, and play ZZT games. So it has never been more accessible to play ZZT. All you have to do is go to that website, open a ZZT game. Like, you can use this great search system to search for whatever you want. Like, if you want to find someone's like Sonic the Hedgehog fan game, you can go there and search Sonic and you'll get like 5 Sonic games. And then you just can play it right in your browser. And because Zeta is so lightweight, it just runs extremely quickly. There's no lag. It doesn't really break very often. It works very astonishingly well. So I really got to give a lot of props to this programmer, Azi Kierka, because their work is like incredible to me, very difficult to do, and like single-handedly like doing a lot to revive the ZZT community and keep it accessible to people.
Yeah, I'm having trouble just wrapping my mind around that. That is amazing. And it's, I guess, one thing I find really impressive, I guess, is that none of this activity is necessarily profit generating in any way.
Mm-hmm.
These are just people who are enthusiastic about these games, these online communities. So it's, I think that's increasingly rare these days, right?
I think so. I mean, I think that this is sort of a, I look at it as kind of folk art. This is like artwork that is created by regular people using the tools at hand for no profit, no particular end aside from expressing themselves and perhaps impressing other people in their own community of like players. And to me, that's very profound. You know, I mean, like, before I made this series before I was making stuff for Means TV, I was making stuff on my own, and with Mitchell, we were making stuff that we didn't really expect to ever make more money than it took to make it, right? Like, we were spending more on it than we ever expected to gain back from it. So I can certainly connect with hobbyist game development, and I think, you know, I understand where people are coming from, and I think I love to support that kind of like creative, like folk art.
Yeah, I would say in terms of, you know, maybe whether that kind of work is receding or if there's less of it these days, you know, if you were to make that observation, it certainly wouldn't be based on, you know, just like, you know, people personally deciding like, oh, I don't want to do this as much, or I think I would rather do more work for money or something. I think it more so comes from just like structurally, you know, how things are changing in the world, how, you know, people are now incentivized to turn all of their passions into like their side hustle, right? And so you get a lot of that stuff. And it's definitely like these external pressures, you know, kind of forcing people to sort of make a buck off of everything they do, I think. And you still get, you know, people obviously not doing that. You know, you'll get like shit posters, which is maybe kind of a very lowbrow example of this kind of thing. But, you know, there's people who do stuff creatively. And it's just, it feels like with the way the world is, it's harder and harder these days to justify not setting up that Patreon, et cetera, which is a shame.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The side hustle.
Yeah, it's I connect with that because it's a constant struggle for me to sort of balance trying to figure out what the algorithm likes in terms of YouTube,
right?
And trying to have things that I know are not necessarily going to go viral per se, but are important to me and I think valuable to have out there. It is a constant sort of struggle to navigate that world.
It is a really, weird time to be a quote unquote creative, which I feel like is also now like a new term for it. You know, if it hasn't been, you know, clear from, you know, what we've been able to talk about, Derek has much more of a background in archiving and sort of library preservation, that sort of information science. You know, he's got a master's degree in it. I am almost exclusively, an artist. I went to film school, unfortunately.
Technically, I did too, but it was more film
true,
studies. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But to say I only went to film school, right? I don't have other smart stuff to say. But yeah, it's I've had those kinds of conversations with a lot of my fellow like freelance friends who work in the film industry, who work in animation and stuff, actor friends, etc. And I was talking to one of my friends whose day job is being a server at a very, very high end, restaurant in Manhattan, right by Central Park. So, they've served like Oprah before, etc. And, just talking about like how successful that career has been for them, even when it's sometimes hard to come by that success in the art world, and still like grappling with like, it's totally appropriate to still see yourself as an artist, even if, most of your professional career is in something entirely unrelated. And to an extent, I think that's a more interesting position to have, compared to, most of my professional work is doing like freelance animation work. And I think there's something to be said about, doing art for its sake rather than to make rent. So it's definitely something I've been thinking about, unrelated, but
yeah, right now.
No, I think it is related in the way in which we sort of are made to internalize the idea that if we're not making a living doing something, then we're kind of like a failure in that field.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really harmful, and it deters a lot of people from pursuing something they might be, they might have a great talent.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think like, yeah, low stakes creativity needs to be like something you allow yourself, right? Like you can create great art without like it going anywhere, without it leading to any money whatsoever or any kind of clout or admiration or whatever. And that's still a worthwhile pursuit. And I think, I don't know. I just wish more people would understand that.
Yeah, me too. I think this project might help people kind of open up to that. Do you want to talk about how you got involved with Means TV? I'm just curious.
Yeah, sure. So something that I like to say about Means TV is that it's one of the few streaming services where you can see things that aren't made by people who have rich uncles. So like they are pretty open to submissions. I mean, they only accept stuff that like is good, that they like, that also aligns with the political values of Means TV, which is to say leftist. But yeah, I emailed them out of the blue. I heard the two founders give an interview on a podcast, and I was like, oh, this is a pretty cool project. And apparently they're open to submissions. So I submitted Sarasota Half in Dream, the feature that I talked about earlier that Mitchell and I made. And I thought, like, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to hear back from them. Like, sending an email out of the blue to someone with your film never works. Like, I don't know. Maybe you could count the number of times that's worked on one hand. But it worked. It took a few months because they were super busy, starting up the platform and everything. But I got an email back from them like, hey, we're interested. This is great. And I was like blown away. Like, wow, I cannot believe they even took the time to watch a film sent to them by a stranger, and not just a stranger, but someone who has absolutely no like following, clout, or connections, right? Like, again, this was a film that Mitchell and I made as a hobbyist thing that like very few people even knew about. So they liked the film a lot. They put it on the platform, and they even made it one of their debut. Like they did a couple of like in-person screenings when they launched Means TV, and one of them was our film, which really blew my mind. That was a ton of fun. So yeah, so that's kind of how we got involved, was just like getting in touch with them and them liking the stuff we sent. And from there, we've had a great time working with them, and everything we've made since then, we've made in collaboration with them, and it's been great. Means TV is awesome.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to add to that anecdote is, so before we heard back from Means TV, obviously we were trying to figure out, once we had this film done, what to do with it. And for a long time we were thinking, oh, we might just put it online, put it on Vimeo publicly or whatever. No one's going to be interested, but at least it'll be out there and it'll be done. And if you have seen Sarasota Half and Dream, I mean, not to give it away, but one thing I always like to recall is in the email that we initially got back from Means TV, when they, told us that they had watched and enjoyed the film. There's a quote that is, to paraphrase it, the 20 minutes spent on parking garages, ... perfect. And,
incredible, I think was what they said.
Incredible. Yeah, the 20 minutes spent on parking garages, incredible. And that's not something that you could say about most films that you enjoyed the 20 minutes sort of like focused on parking garages in a suburban Florida town. But, there you have it.
It's also funny because technically it was like 5 minutes, but it kind of feels longer than it is, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But in a good way, apparently.
I'll have to check that out. What do you think about this proliferation of, like Dan Bell's Dead Mall series and things along those lines?
I haven't watched much of that. I think I saw like a little bit of one of those videos, but it's kind of cool. Well, I've seen a YouTube video of someone walking through a dead mall and talking about its history. It might have been from that series, but
right.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's like looking at the like bombed out remains of like American like boom capital, like capitalism. There's sort of a nostalgia to it, and there's sort of a mourning of a different way of life in the US. But I also don't know that those malls were ever actually something to be celebrated that much. Like, I think that sometimes the I don't know, the like what's the word I'm reaching for here? The reverence toward like, this was once a great pillar of our community is like a little bit overstated. Right. I don't know if that person did or not. I'm not that familiar with the series. I think that sometimes people in general tend to overstate that a little bit, but I do find it interesting. And like the Sarasota Half and Dream is about like exploring like the ruins of suburbia. So I can certainly relate. Like there's a certain aesthetic beauty to nature reclaiming an abandoned human space. And there's also sort of a beauty to like, this was a highly regimented space that required certain type of behavior. Like in our film, we looked at an abandoned an abandoned golf course. And you can think about all the like rich white old wasps in Sarasota, Florida playing golf. And, there's a certain perverse joy in maybe not perverse at all, actually. There's a certain liberatory joy in walking through this overgrown, abandoned golf course and going through the old wrecked buildings and being like, this space is for me now, not for them.
I like that you specifically said the rich old white wasps of Sarasota, Derek. Yeah. Because as you and I both know, it's gone from human wasps to literal insect wasps.
Oh, yeah, they're infesting it.
Yeah, everywhere in that place.
That's an improvement in my book.
I would say so.
Yeah, I guess it's like the reason I brought up the Dead Mall series is because it's sort of what you were talking about sort of reminded me of that. There's a number of ways in which you can kind of appreciate it, right?
I would say.
I do think.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I do think that's a smart connection to make. World's Chat is essentially a dead mall. There are dead malls within World's Chat. There are stores where you can purportedly buy like David Bowie shirts, but if you click the link, it leads to a broken website. So like, yeah, literally a dead online mall. Yeah, and yet there's still beauty in seeing what people have done with it today.
It's very much like it gives me vaporwave vibes.
Absolutely, sure. Big fan of the aesthetic
for sure. Is there anything else you guys want to plug before we wrap up here?
Well, I'll just say if you haven't seen the series yet, You can watch Preserving Worlds online totally free. It's unlocked even if you're not a subscriber to Means TV. You can go to Means TV and watch all 6 episodes. If you are a subscriber, there's bonus content for each episode. It's not like an extended cut or like, taking the episode and, adding stuff. It's a whole new sort of set of content for each episode. Derek and I just like revisit each of the games that we cover in the series. And
I have an improvisational thing. Yeah, we just improvisationally have a lot of fun in those worlds and explore new areas and check out some new weird stuff that didn't come up in the series itself.
Yeah. So if you want to feel like you're having a bit of a parasocial relationship with Derek and I, you can go ahead and check those out. But speaking of being a subscriber to Means TV, obviously we would ask, you consider that. It's $10 a month, or if you email them, I believe info@means.media, they are willing to, work with you based on what you can afford. So even as low as $0 a month, they're willing to, make that work for you. So that's, a very cool part of their philosophy in action.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I will have I'll be sure to have links to all this good stuff in the show notes. So check out the show notes. And is there any interest in possibly continuing this series?
Maybe. We haven't come to a decision on that at all, but it's definitely a possibility. And there are certainly other virtual worlds that we could cover that we didn't in this run. We actually had a couple of episodes planned that we just weren't able to get the interviews going in time. So we almost looked at Active Worlds and Furcadia. So if we do ever do more episodes, those might be subjects of them.
Yeah. And we've also gotten some great suggestions from people on Twitter since, the series has come out. A lot of people sort of plugging their online spaces and such. So that's been really cool to see as well. Yeah. Whether or not the series happens, Derek and I will still be putting out stuff, I'm sure. And Means TV is most definitely the place where you're going to see it.
That wraps it up for this episode of Nightmare Tonight. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoy my content and want to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so at patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Thanks for listening, and good night.